Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran jazz guitarist Mimi Fox. She is promoting her 2017 CD with the San Francisco String Trio called May I Introduce You as a tribute to the Beatles. She has been named a winner in 6 consecutive Downbeat Magazine International Critics polls and came on to the international jazz scene in the 1990s with a pair of CDs. These days she maintains a whirlwind touring schedule, playing major festivals from New York to Tokyo. She is also a very busy composer and a great educator. So get to know her and dig this interview, my friends.
Amy, thank you for taking a minute out for me today. I appreciate it.
Oh, you bet, Joe. Happy to do so.
So let's go ahead and hop in here, and I just want to get an idea from you. You did a collaboration with the San Francisco String Trio, May I Introduce You, recently. It's a great album. What is it like to cover Beatles tunes in kind of this jazzy way?
Well, you know, it's funny. I think one of the amazing things about the Beatles, I mean, I would say specifically, you know, Paul McCartney's beautiful melodies, is that they are, you know, they're not only timeless, but they're just, you know, they're a part of all of our lives. I mean, and the Beatles have spanned so many generations, you know, I mean, from folks older than me to my godchild and everybody in between, because they're just, you know, they're great melodies, they're great songs. And so the tie-in, really the link to jazz, is the fact that if you take a beautiful Beatles song like She's Leaving Home or Blackbird or And I Love Her, I mean, those are ballads that the melodies are as beautiful as anything that Irving Berlin or Hoagy Carmichael or Rodgers and Hart or the Gershwins, you know, those melodies, you know, stand up, as do all of the great ballads like Skylark and My Romance that are part of the Great American Songbook. And so, you know, even though the Beatles aren't American, you know, they are, you know, are not from the States and part of, again, what we call the Great American Songbook and that, you know, wonderful, you know, rich legacy. I believe that their songs and their melodies can be taken and stand up just fine in that, you know, pantheon of great music. And so for all of us in the San Francisco String Trio, that was the challenge, was to, you know, we each took different pieces and we would work on them on our own, and then we would come together as a group and you know, try them out and, you know, make suggestions and then rewrite. And so it was a very collaborative, fun process for us.
Right on. So let me get back to the beginnings of your life. Born in New York City, started on the drums at 9, guitar at 10. You had a lot of music around you. Talk to me about your childhood and how you really kind of got geared towards a life in music.
Well, you know, I grew up, you know, in New York, and I had, you know, in my family, it was kind of a very boisterous, kind of chaotic family, and we had, our cousins were around and lots of neighbors and friends, and so there was always a lot going on, and it was, and there was music going on all the time. I mean, my mom and dad loved jazz, and so even though I was the youngest, and so my older brother and sister were listening to the Beatles and to Motown and you know, R&B and stuff like that. You know, I also got exposed to jazz through my parents because that was the music of their generation. And so my dad had all these great recordings, and my mom actually was a songwriter and singer, and she did it sort of semi-professionally in addition to trying to raise the family, crazy family, up until the time I was about 12 or 13, so I'd hear her sing, and she turned me on to, you know, Ella Fitzgerald and all of the great singers, and Sarah Vaughan, and, you know, Dinah Washington. So I heard all of that and started to hear as I mentioned, the Great American Songbook material. And yet my dad had all these old jazz recordings, and I love the rhythms and the feeling of jazz. You know, I would take my mom's soup pots and bang along to my dad's records, and you know, so that's why when I was 9, my mom got me a little snare drum, and I started to play that. And then I was when I was in junior high, I started playing in the jazz band. I played drums in the jazz band through junior high and high school, and but then I got a guitar about a year later when I was 10. My mom saved up money and got me this tiny little guitar, and I just loved it, you know, from the moment I started playing. So yeah, there was just kind of music all around, even though really it was my mom who had the real link in that she wrote songs, and she was self-taught, but her songs were good, and she taught me a lot just from osmosis and from being around her. So, I just picked up a lot from listening.
Well, but it was ultimately John Coltrane's Giant Steps that lured you into jazz, correct?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's what I would call my, sort of amazingly accidental foray. I mean, it wasn't accidental to the extent that I was 14 and I had, different friends that, would mention John Coltrane to me. And so I started to hear his name and stuff. And I happened to be out at this record store and his, seminal album, well, unknown to me that it was seminal, Giant Steps, was on sale. And I just thought, well, maybe I'll buy this album. So I bought the album and I took it home, and it just absolutely blew my mind because, it's one thing to hear Ella Fitzgerald sing a Tisket a Tasket, and it's another thing to hear John Coltrane just, devastating a blues or a ballad or, playing one of his own really incendiary pieces. I was just blown away. I mean, I'm still, if I was stuck on a desert island, that would definitely be one of the albums that I would take with me. It's still one of my favorite albums, even after, having played it to death for a gazillion years. So, that was my first exposure to, amazing, instrumental jazz. So.
Wonderful. So let's kind of move on the trajectory of your timeline and your geography. You go from New York to San Francisco, and you start playing out there. Talk to me about how that came about.
Well, actually, first I was in L.A. What happened is my dad, may he rest in peace, was very worried. We had a big fight before I left New York, and he was like, I don't know why you want to go to San Francisco. There's just a bunch of hippies there. You'll never make a living. It's going to be too hard to make a living in music. Why don't you go to L.A. and do studio work? So even though I had visited San Francisco when I was younger, and I really had loved it for a lot of different reasons. I did take my dad's advice, and I did go to L.A. for a few months, and I actually had worked my way in and was starting to do some studio work. L.A. really wasn't for me, and I also realized from working with different producers and different things that wasn't what I wanted to do. I really didn't want to spend my life having to imitate other players for, parts that they needed for certain songs, and it really wasn't very creative. And I thought, well, this is just not who I am and not what I want to do. So I lasted in LA about 6 months, and then I moved up to San Francisco, and it was a great jazz scene then at the time that I moved up, and there was also just a lot of different things going on. So I was able to work my way into different communities and begin to just play with everybody. That was a great, really a great learning experience for me because I had the opportunity to play with a lot of great musicians, and they really, nurtured me and encouraged me. So that was, really invaluable, time for me.
So you really got kind of vaulted into the international jazz scene with, projects with Joey DeFrancesco and the Yellow Jackets. Talk to me about those early years and kind of how you really started getting immersed in the jazz world. How did that happen?
It was a process, Joe, because, obviously at different points in my life, I thought very seriously about going back to New York because there's not a lot of artists that can launch an international jazz career from the West Coast, and for many reasons, not just because New York is still the hub of the jazz world, but it's also a lot closer to Europe, and there are just things that for many different reasons, it's just harder from the West Coast. But I was very persistent, and once I moved up to the San Francisco Bay Area, I fell in love with the place and the people and the diversity. There was just so much that I loved about the Bay Area, let alone the weather, because I had lived through grown up with East Coast winters and really tough New York weather, and I just didn't I was not interested in sort of going back and doing that. So, and plus I gradually started touring, and so I was going back to New York and playing concerts and playing at some nice rooms and going to Boston and going to D.C. and so I was able to get, and then for a while I was an adjunct professor at NYU, where I would also come back and do master workshops and guitar intensives in New York. So I was getting to spend enough time in New York that I would, felt like I had met a lot of folks, and my name was starting to spread, even though I didn't actually live in New York, so much so that sometimes people would call me and say, hey, Mimi, we'd like to hire you. We're going to go to Europe in 3 months, and we're having rehearsals. Can you make a rehearsal in Brooklyn tomorrow night? And I'd say, yeah, I can't make a rehearsal in Brooklyn tomorrow night because I'm in San Francisco. And they're like, really? I thought you lived in New York. That kind of thing would happen sometimes. But, I was very tenacious. I had a really good manager for many years, and we, the two of us were just like a formidable team. I mean, initially, I had to spend a lot of time going to jam sessions and hanging out, and that was pretty brutal in the, the 80s, because I was almost always the only woman, and certainly the only woman instrumentalist, and so, I had to put up with sort of a pretty hostile kind of environment at times, but as I've told my students, I also found a lot of people, women and men, that were very nurturing and really, valued me and taught me how to value myself, I think, as a musician and an artist. So, I'm grateful for all the experiences I have, even some that are kind of unpleasant, because I think it's made me more compassionate and it's made me a better human being.
So let me ask you this. You've had 10-plus albums. You've been all over, Europe and the world, a lot of parts of the world. How do you feel about your career? How do you feel like things have worked out for you?
Well, I would have to say it depends. Sometimes, it's the half empty, half full. There are still some things that I would like to do, players I'd like to work with that I haven't yet done, so that's something that I'm aiming for. There are aspects of the music business, per se, that myself and all other artists have to contend with: booking agents, clubs, festivals, politics. There's a lot of different aspects of it that are really anathema to who I am as a person, and I think really anathema to who most artists are, in that the term music and business really are like a sort of incompatible for who we are as human beings, as artists. I mean, there's a lot of it that really doesn't have anything to do with the actual art, that are sort of a necessary evil that you have to contend with. And so certainly there are those things that I would love to have less of in my life, less aggravation with some of these things. But really, overwhelmingly, Joe, if I look at my life, I feel I'm very grateful. I have worked very hard, but I've also had some amazing mentors and amazing people in my life that have, helped me. And so, there's maybe a handful of musicians from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm one of them, that have been able to, establish international reputations through, but living on the West Coast, which is a liability. So I feel very lucky, and I'm very grateful for what I have. And again, all the sort of hard knocks that I took along the way, I think have deepened me and I hope made me a better person.
So the one thing you mentioned was mentor. You're a teacher and a clinician, and I want to ask you this. What did you learn from your mentors that has made you a better teacher?
That's a great question. Well, the most important thing, like, I had the opportunity to study with Joe Pass, and Joe said several things to me that I'll never forget. One of the things that he said to me at the time, and this was, I was in my early 30s at that time when I saw him. He said, you have all the technique you're ever going to need. He said, I think you're practicing too much. Why don't you just listen to string quartets and take a walk around the lake and just relax? Because I was a very driven, kind of intense person. I still am, but I think I've some of the hard edges have been softened a little bit over time, Joe. But yeah, so he said that to me. He also said, you have a lot of fire in the belly, so don't lose that. So from that experience, what I try to pass on when I have students that are really talented but perhaps a little high-strung and maybe pushing themselves too hard. I've seen guys as young as 18 years old having tendinitis and carpal tunnel and all these problems because they're practicing, a ridiculous amount every day, and they're they're pushing themselves beyond, what the body can endure. And not just the body, but the mind. I've seen some talented students just really push themselves just mercilessly and with great, and suffering some pretty severe consequences. So from Joe, I learned to try to impart to my students a sense that, that there's enough time and that you do not need to try to, push yourself so ridiculously hard all the time, that it's important to take breaks, and that the breaks are part of a rejuvenation process that happens for artists that are just as important as all the time you spend woodshedding. That's something that I learned from him. And then Bruce Foreman, the great bebop guitarist, who is another big influence. Bruce said to me, I asked him once after we had played together at some guitar summit, I said, Bruce, do you have any other, tips for me? Because I had studied with him on and off for a few years. He was in San Francisco at that point. And he said, Mimi, you're getting in some great situations. You're playing with some great people. He said, let them teach you. Let them teach you. And I thought that what an interesting way of putting it. But what he was trying to say was, don't be defensive, don't be guarded, and be receptive and be a sponge and take in what people have to offer. And so I think those are some of the biggest things that I learned from both Joe and from Bruce Foreman. Of course, there were many other things, but those two things I think really stand out when you ask me that question, Joe.
So let me ask you this. Why do you love jazz?
Why do I love jazz? It's funny, Joe, I don't think of myself as a jazz snob. I love so many kinds of music, as long as it's done well and the practitioners are great. I mean, I love classical music. I love flamenco. I love folk music. I love funk and R&B still. There's no style that I don't appreciate fully. And even, it's funny, over the past few years, when I signed with Favored Nations Recording, which was Steve Vai's label, and Steve, of course, had played with Frank Zappa and was, a big rock star, which I didn't know because I didn't really follow rock. The one type of music that had sort of eluded me was metal and hard rock and that kind of stuff. And just because it wasn't something that I really had ever listened to or gravitated towards. But from knowing Steve, and then I started to meet a lot of other rock stars and rock guys over the years through my acquaintance with Steve. And I really got an appreciation for what they do. And that's something that, that I hadn't really had before. So there's no style that I don't appreciate and really respect, really enjoy. But the reason, and come back to your question, the reason that I love jazz is that, to me, jazz gives me the freedom to be able to, because jazz encompasses so much, because jazz is a very wide musical palette. I mean, jazz is bebop, jazz can be a beautiful ballad, jazz can be a samba or a mambo or any of, it can be Afro-Cuban jazz. I mean, there are so many different, it can be old school, it can encompass funk and R&B and hip-hop and other things. So because jazz is so wide open and gives me the freedom to express myself at any given moment in time, and it's also paradoxically a very demanding discipline where, to get to a high level in jazz where you can even call yourself a jazz musician. You just don't wake up and call yourself a jazz musician. I mean, it's like years and years of study and understanding harmony and melody and rhythms and, scales and arpeggios and practicing till you're blue in the face. But all of that study is so that when you step on the bandstand, you can just be free. And so that's what I really love about jazz. I love the fact that it comes from, it's born out of, sociologically, if you go back to the history of jazz, which comes from the blues, which comes from, many, many sources, but in our country, what African Americans endured as slaves, and then the call and response in some of the early music that was created, that they created, which forms the backbone of the music. It's a very rich legacy. I'm proud of it. I mean, I think as Americans, we can be so proud of that as our indigenous art form, because it's born out of pain, but it's also born out of a tremendous resistance and a tremendous triumph of the human spirit. And so, so for all of these reasons, I love jazz, and that's why I consider myself a jazz musician. But I'm happy if someone says to me when they listen to an album, oh, I heard elements of folk music, or I heard classical guitar, or I heard, and anything else, that's fine with me, because it's all part of what goes into my, sort of creative pot, and that gets stirred up.
So let me ask you this. Everyone has a version of who you are, your family, your friends, and your fans. But who do you think you are? When you face your day, you wake up, who are you?
Joe, you're asking something. I got to tell you, I have done 10 million interviews over the years, radio, TV, print, and you're asking, I'm going to remember these, Joe, because you're asking me some questions I'm actually really having to think.
Good. I like it.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, I like it too, but I'm just trying to think here. Let's see, who am I? When I wake up each day, I am an artist. I do feel that is one of my biggest things. I feel like as a composer, as a musician and a composer, I hear music a lot, Joe. That's a lot of my life, and it's funny. Obviously, it was actually Bruce Forman. When I first moved to the Bay Area, I was still playing drums, and I was playing drums still professionally as well as playing guitar. And Bruce said to me one time during our first lessons, he said, you gotta make a choice, girlfriend. He said, you can't master both of these things and play them at the high level that you want. He said, make a choice. And it was like someone said to me, chop off your left arm or your right arm. I was like, you're kidding me. I did make a choice because guitar is my composing instrument. That being said, there is no time when I'm not tapping on my desk, tapping on my guitar as I'm thinking about things, tapping as I'm loading the dishwasher, tapping as I'm waiting for a train, tapping when I'm waiting for the plane, when I'm on tour. So I'm always hearing rhythms and I'm always hearing melodies. So I would have to say that for me, who I am, I experience the world through my ears and through what I hear. Whatever I take in, I experience it as an artist, as a musician, and as a composer. When I feel something, I hear something as a response to whatever is going on, and that's how I compose. It's based on everything gets I take things in as a sponge, as a kind of human sponge, and then I hopefully try to make something beautiful come out of it. So, I'm a wife or a spouse. I'm a friend to my friends. I'm a sister to my sister. I've got a lot of people I love in my life. But I have to say that from the first moment I wake up, usually to the moment I go to bed, Joe, I am an artist, I guess, first and foremost, because that's how I experience life.
Beautiful. I like that answer.
Yeah, beautiful, because you're asking me really good questions, Joe.
Coming off of that question, I got one more question that I want to ask you, and I want to ask you this. I know you're far from being done in this world and with your music and your journey, but when you look back on your life in music, how do you want the world of jazz to remember you? When they peel back the layers and the names and go through and that finger comes across your name, what do you want to be remembered for what you did for music and for jazz?
I want to be remembered as a heartfelt and deep musician and composer, someone that kind of took a lot of chances and laid it all out, that who I became, emotionally and spiritually as I developed as an artist led me to realizing that through vulnerability and through receptivity, I was able to create my best music, and that vulnerability is a true strength, and that it takes a lot of strength to be able to be vulnerable and to share that with the world. And so I would hope, I've mentored a lot of people myself as an educator, and I have received a lot of great strokes for that, and I'm very grateful that I have served as a role model to young women and to young men, just as to how to be a good person as well as being a successful artist. But I think if I could be looked back as someone that played from the heart and left it all on the floor, basically, I would be happy. And I hope that some of my compositions will, be played years later, that people will say, wow, this is a beautiful tune. This moves me. That's my goal. If I can move people, if I can touch people, I will feel like I did the right thing with my life.
No doubt you have. Mimi, thank you for taking some time out for me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, Joe, thanks so much, and I'll look forward to catching you the next time I'm in your area.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, San Francisco, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Mimi for her time and her music. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store. Visit neonjazz at youtube.com, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.